Invite you to take your seats. I'm Dr. James Watson, and Pastor Suzette and a team from Lighthouse Church are currently attending a conference called Exponential, and we're very excited that they're able to be there. I welcome you to pray for them through this week, that God might teach them the things that are there specifically for them to hear, and that they might have some inspiration from hearing from people involved in new churches all across the United States and Canada. So it's a very exciting time, and I'm very glad that they're able to do that. As some of you know, I grew up on a farm about an hour and a half north of here, outside of a small town called Durham. It's just like a one stoplight town, and on a gravel road out on the farm. And I played soccer in Durham. So Durham was actually a hockey and baseball town. So those were the most popular sports and the things that people really had their hearts into. But there's a few of us who gathered together and would play soccer, some coaches that were willing to take us on as kids. And I think I was probably on the first soccer team for that town since like early European settlers came over and were playing English football. When Kathy and I moved to Kitchener and we started our family, when our children were very small, we started taking them to the YMCA to get swimming lessons. We wanted them to be safe around the water, and this seemed like a great way to do that, and it wasn't too expensive there, so we could kind of afford it. And as we looked at what else was offered, I realized they had a men's pickup soccer game that I could go to in one of the gyms. And I went into the game with a little bit of apprehension. I knew Kitchener had a much better soccer development program than where I grew up. I knew there's a number of people who'd moved to Kitchener from other countries where soccer was just woven into the culture, and that people started playing from a very young age. And so I knew that the level of play was going to be above what I was used to. I went out and sort of played my heart out, had a lot of fun, and at the end, as people were still sort of lingering and going off into whatever else they were doing in their day, there's one fellow who stayed back and he entered into a conversation with me. And he wanted to sort of get to know who I was, where I'd come from. And so he asked me the question, well, where are you from? And I said, I'm just Canadian. He said, nobody is just Canadian. You got to be Canadian and something else. And so I kind of picked up on that. And he said, are you German? And I thought, okay, so not just any European country, but like a World Cup champion. My soccer mustn't have been too bad. I must have been doing okay. And I said, no, my granddad immigrated to Canada from Ireland. He said, okay, Ireland. So then that gave him some sort of reference point for who I was and where I'd come from. And the conversation went on from there. This morning, I want to tell you a little story that comes from a famous church leader in Ireland whose name is Maewyn. Leaving out the worship team who heard the sermon, the first part, and Kathy, who's heard variations on this sermon all week, does anyone else know who Maewyn is? Okay, that's great. Maewyn is someone who lived 1,600 years ago in England, was born and raised in England, was part of the church in England at that time. And when he was about 16 years old, tragedy struck. And Irish raiders came across from Ireland to England and took Maewyn and a bunch of other people from the household and sold them into slavery in Ireland. And so you can try to imagine what it'd be like as a teenager to be taken away from your family, essentially brought into captivity and working in servitude. He was working for a chieftain in an area in Ireland. I think we have a picture of some of the hills there. One of my friends who lives in Belfast had been hiking out in Northern Ireland a couple weeks ago and sent us some pictures. And so this is one of the areas that Maewyn might have landed in and started taking care of sheep and taking care of cattle and taking care of pigs for the Irish chieftain. What is our response when something unexpected, unplanned, and unpleasant happens in our lives? It's kind of hard to imagine this level of disruption, right, of being someone who's kidnapped. This kind of thing that shows up on the movie screen here through the rest of the week. That dramatic of a story. Well, one of the things that Maywin had going for him is he was familiar with the stories of faith. Pastor Suzette's been preaching about Joseph and talking about how Joseph, at a young age, because of jealousy within the family, was sold by his brothers into slavery and ended up in servitude in another country, in Egypt. And there he sort of learned what it meant to be faithful both to God, but also to serve well, to learn the language, learn the customs. That story sort of parallels what Maywin was experiencing. Learning how to talk to people, learning what the customs were, learning how to exist and serve in a place and in an area of responsibility that he may not have ever chosen for himself. One of the other things we've learned from some of the writings from Maywin that have been passed down is he prayed like hundreds of times a day. And this just became part of his rhythm as he's working the fields for the Irish chieftain. Pray when he gets up in the morning. He'd pray as he's going out in the field. He'd pray as he's, going through his day, as he's entering into his slumber. And that became just part of life for him. About 6 years into his captivity, he's praying. And he hears the Lord say to him, "It's now time for you to go." He escapes. He hikes across the island to the coast, finds a ship that will take him, and returns back to England. In England, he eventually enters into the ministry. He becomes a minister of the gospel, and he starts to serve within the church. Probably a relatively comfortable life compared to what he'd experienced previously. One night, he has a dream. And in this dream, he sees someone from Ireland calling out to him and saying, "Come and walk among us again." And Maywin interprets this as God making that offer, that challenge of calling him back to the people that held him in captivity. So what might have been going through Maywin's mind in those moments? Well, we know that he knew the story of Jesus entering into our world and walking among us, of the love that God showed through Jesus' actions, the way in which Jesus, through his teaching, oriented people to who God really was, and his self-sacrificial love in his death, and then his resurrection, where he called his early followers to continue to share God's love wherever they might go. I was going to read to you one passage this morning that sort of encapsulates some of that moment of sending and of challenging the early followers of Jesus. This comes from Matthew chapter 28. Starting at verse 16. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. And when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age." So Maywin returns to the land of his captivity. As he walks inland from the coast, he connects with one of the local Irish chieftains who, when he hears this story of Jesus, offers him a barn on a hill. And that's the place where Maywin is able to gather people for worship and to learn about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So I have a photo for you. And this comes from a trip that Kathy and I took a few years ago. We were able to visit our friends in Belfast, and they took us on a bit of a local tour. And I was able to take this, Kathy and I were able to take this photo of this small stone chapel that sits on the hill where Maywin first was granted land to start worship services. So 1,600 years later, there is still a worshiping congregation in this space. What is it that you and I are doing now that is going to have a lasting impact, like for 1,600 years? Probably we don't know the answer to that question. And it might be surprising to us if God revealed exactly how things are going to unfold in the future and the kind of impact that we might have. Worshiping here this morning. This opportunity to encounter God has an impact on our lives. But as we carry what we know of God through our week, what impact might that have on others? Lots more could be said about Maywin, but he was inspired by God to risk everything, to demonstrate love to the people who had shown him disdain, had kept him in a subservient menial role for 6 years. But in those 6 years, he learned the local language, he knew the customs, he became acquainted with an Irish chieftain and learned sort of how government operated in that land that was so distinct from his own. And when he returned, he brought all the things that God had taught him with him and was able to instruct and able to teach, able to inspire a number of the Irish people and what it meant to follow Jesus. When we think about the word legacy, what does that mean to us? What is it that you have a sense of that right now, today, you're doing something that is contributing to a legacy that will last into the future? As you think back over the past year, where have there been times where God has revealed to you, oh, this is something that has made an impact. This is something that's significant. If Jesus tarries, thousands of years from now, what is it that we will have accomplished? Our names might not be remembered, but the spiritual impact of who we were carries on. We sang this morning about generations. Through our song, we prayed that God would bless from generation to generation. Such powerful words. I've had a couple of opportunities to have small windows into how God works across generations. My father is 91. He'll be 92 at the end of the month. And I got a call a number of months ago from his pastor. And Pastor Kevin said, "James, would you like to hear a story about your dad?" So I was kind of curious as to what kind of story I'd hear about my dad, but was happy to hear him tell me what he was willing to share. And Pastor Kevin said, "I got a phone call. And this person said, 'Are you the pastor of Durham Baptist Church?' And Pastor Kevin said, yes, I am. And the lady on the other end of the call said, well, I used to go there as a child. I was one of the children who was affected by the 60s scoop in Canada. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it was a policy that was put into effect to remove Indigenous children from their biological homes and place them into foster care. And it was a very broad, sweeping policy across many communities across Canada. And the lady shared with Pastor Kevin that the foster family she was placed with was not a good match, and she was treated not well. She said, but I need to say thanks to Durham Baptist Church because for 1 or 2 hours a week, I had sanctuary. And I felt God's presence and experienced hope. She told Pastor Kevin, I'm not sure where I would be today if it wasn't for your church. And she said, do you have someone at your church named Bob Watson? Pastor Kevin said, yes, we do. Bob is still here, still a member. And she said, well, he would drive by and pick me up on every Sunday and bring me to church. You see, my father was like a career farmer, but he also drove a school bus. And so he was kind of known in the community in that rural area, and people entrusted him with their children. And so he could go and talk to a family and say, would you like if I brought your child to Sunday school and to church? And because they knew him, knew where he lived, knew who he was, that was something that he was able to do for a number of families in the surrounding area, even if the family had no contact with church. When I talked to my dad about this story, he couldn't recollect who this might have been or which child it was that he had actually provided this service that then had that kind of lasting impact decades later. Last night, Kathy and I went over to our son's house and had a meal with them. And as we were chatting, he talked about having a friend that they would check in with every so often, but they could never predict where in the world this individual was. He was a young adult who was kind of trying to find himself and was very, very intentional at seeking out what is true, what is real, and literally circumnavigated the globe, went all the way around the world, visiting different places. Apparently he volunteered in a soup kitchen that the Sikh community would put on in the Punjab. He bumped into the Dalai Lama on his travels. This is a widely journeyed individual who has now sort of settled in Canada. And so our son was talking to him, and he said, I'm beginning to realize that even though I want to do good, I really don't know what that is. I have no moral direction outside of myself. And I don't think I can really offer something of value to this world, and I don't think I can really improve myself without having some kind of external direction. And so I've been seeking around for where it is that there's something worthwhile I can commit myself to that will give me direction in life. He said, as I was reflecting on this, I realized that some of my friends who've shown kindness to me and who seem to be somewhat grounded in how they experience life were Christians. And so decided I would try out church. And so every week I've been going on Sundays to church. And then shared with my son some of his experiences and what he's reflecting on and what his interpretation was of what was going on in church, which was great for my son. He really enjoyed having that deeper level of conversation. But did the people who had influence on this young man's life actually know that that's the influence they were having? Or was God using their faithfulness, their willingness to be a kind and trustworthy friend, as a way that opened the door for him to consider of all the possible options for trying to find direction in life, that maybe Jesus offers that external reference point for what it means to offer something of value to the world around us. I'm sure that I can sit down with any of you and hear these kinds of stories from your families. These moments where we realize how God has been at work when we didn't know at the time that this is what was happening. It'd be amazing with the group of people here if we could actually map out all the different ways in which God has had opportunity to make connections with others through the generations of families sitting in this room. I want to take you back in history about 4,000 years ago. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the story of Abram. So if you look at Genesis chapter 12, we have the journey of Abram starting. And I'm going to read to you verses 1 to 3. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I'll make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." It's that phrase, all peoples on earth will be blessed. As many of you know, I work in a seminary, and we do ministry training. And as we talk about how God is at work in the world, we sometimes use the phrase Missio Dei, the mission of God. That God throughout all history has been connecting, has been inviting humans into relationship. What we see in Abram is sort of a way of which God is articulating this as the blessing that will be offered to all people. We know as we read on in Genesis chapter 12 that Abram being invited to go to a place that he did not know and to take those steps was not an easy journey. There are times that he faced hardships, that his family faced hardships. There's times when he really messed up what it was he was being asked to do. Through fear, he made bad decisions. At one point, he's offered hospitality by an Egyptian leader, and because Sarai was very beautiful, Abram became scared that maybe his host was going to take him away or kill him in order to have his wife as his own. And so he said to Sarai, "Just introduce yourself as my sister." You know, as you read through the story, it's quite the drama. The leader becomes aware of this deception and comes back to Abram, "Why did you do this? I don't want that dishonor. I don't want to draw the curse upon myself of taking someone else's wife." And actually then tries to offer restitution and reconciliation to have good relationship again. And Abram has to journey on after learning that. Later, when Abram and Sarah are promised a son, they begin to question or to doubt whether or not that will actually come into being. And so Sarah gives Abram one of her handmaids, one of her servants, and Abram and she have a child, and that creates all sorts of conflict within the family, and they talk about that being a generational thing that becomes an issue for the peoples of that area. But we also have these stories of faithfulness. Abram offers hospitality to strangers and doesn't know that he's entertaining angels of God until they start to talk about how God is at work, and he engages with them about what that means for the future. Some of us this morning are facing that moment when we're being asked to step into uncertainty, when a door before us is opening and we don't know exactly where it's going to go. In those moments, God is with you. You can choose to take that step and place your trust that God is going to make something out of that moment in your life. Some of us are in positions where it's not the place we hope to be in life. There are things that are not going well. Maybe it's a job, maybe it's health. And in those moments, we're learning patience. We're learning what it means for God to sit with us, perhaps God to weep with us. We're learning compassion. We're learning empathy. And some of you may be at those moments when there's something remarkable happening, beyond what you could have anticipated. And in those moments, God shares in that joy and is willing to offer guidance. Abram wasn't able to fully see this vision that God had given him of all peoples being blessed come to full fruition. We see at several points after Abram where there's ways in which God's glory is made known to the peoples of the earth. And we know that Abram's story sets the context in which 2,000 years later, Jesus is born into this world and walks among us. And from that point, we see how many, many regions of the world, many peoples of the world have been blessed. I chose some stories from Ireland to talk about Maewyn, because that's part of my family history. But I could have just easily taken stories from any part of the world. In my former job, I had an opportunity to be a coach for church planters across Canada. And I would go and sit with them. I'd hear some of their story. I'd hear their dreams, how God was challenging them as to what it was they were to accomplish. One couple were originally from Colombia, had moved to the United States for work opportunities, and then had come to Canada and had had this remarkable reconnecting with God experience through one of the Salvation Army churches in Canada, in Mississauga. And talked about how God had been preparing them for their journey from Colombia to Atlanta to Mississauga to go and start a church in South Shore of Montreal. That the life experiences that they had offered them the opportunity to offer God's blessing in this new place. I've been able to work with colleagues who come from Singapore, who've come from Laos, and who share how God's faithfulness over generations has led them to the point where they are now. I'm currently working on a church planting textbook project with one of my colleagues at Tyndale Seminary. And Dr. Neri Santos is a missionary to Canada from the Philippines. He'd been a pastor for one of the satellite churches for a mega church in Manila. And his pastor came up to him and said, Neri, I think you should go and plant a church in Toronto. We have a lot of people who've left our church, moved to Toronto. I think you should go and start a church there. And as you hear Dr. Neri tell the story, he says, but I don't know anything about Canada. And his pastor pats him on the shoulder and says, you'll learn as you go. And apparently, his pastor was quite famous for telling people, yeah, you can do this. You'll learn as you go. And so Dr. Neri comes to Canada and starts to gather people and look at what does it mean to be not just a Filipino church in the greater Toronto area, but to be a multicultural church, to reach all nations. These kinds of stories are being played out over and over again. I definitely encourage you, if you're not already part of a group here at Lighthouse Church, to take advantage of that opportunity. Kathy and I lead one of the brewing groups that meets on Wednesday nights, and it's been an amazing place to hear these stories of God's faithfulness in the different families connected to the church. There's such an encouragement when you get to hear how God has been at work among us. So, I've told you a little bit about Maywin Socket this morning. You're going to hear more about him through this coming week, probably more on the pop culture side of things, a little bit more of sort of the legends. As part of the tradition of the English church in the 3rd and 4th century, when Maywin became a minister, there is actually a new name given to him. And the new name given to him was Patrick. As Irish immigrants first came to Canada, they brought with them the stories of St. Patrick, and so March 17th became St. Patrick's Day in Canada. Did the uneducated country boy, as he described himself, ever anticipate that some of his encounters with God and how Jesus' love was expressed through him would get shared worldwide through the Irish immigration diaspora? Probably not. And does it matter if our name is what is known hundreds of years from now? I don't think so. But I think we need to recognize how God is at work across the generations. And the ways in which we walk with Jesus now have a spiritual impact that we cannot estimate or predict. I'd like to thank each of you for being here this morning, for gathering for worship together, but I'd also like to thank you for the ways in which you have made yourself available to God. Whether right now is a time of the unknown, whether right now is a time where you're feeling stresses, you're under pressures, or whether now is a time where you're feeling excitement about the possibilities of the future. Your faithfulness in this moment, your willingness to walk with God through this week is a blessing to many. Hallelujah and amen.